on our website. Welcome to the 2021 Civility Month author presentation of Beyond Civility. This is a book that we read last year and invited the authors, Rob Danisch and Bill Keith, to come and speak to us, which they did last year. And it was an eye-opener for me and a good presentation of an invitation to civility that's really important during this time. This is brought to you this year by, as it was last year, by Civility First, which is a small grassroots nonprofit in Island County, Washington. We celebrate all the month of October as Civility Month and have various activities and workshops, this being one of them. I want to welcome Bill Keith and Rob Danisch, who were the authors of the book. And this year, David Frank is joining them. And I understand they have a work underway that I hope we'll hear about. Let me just read a little bit about, well, I just moved to a new home, so I cannot find my copy of your book, guys. But this is what the book looks like. So that's the best I can do. It's in one of the boxes that you see behind me, but it's called Beyond Civility, The Competing Obligations of Citizenship. And from the author and from the Amazon write-up, the book is described as examining the history of the concept and its basis in communication and political theory. William Keith and Robert Danisch present a clear, robust analysis of civil discourse. When viewed as a communication practice for uniting people with differences and making them more equal, civility is transformed from a preferable way of speaking into an essential component of democratic life. Guarding against uncritical endorsement of civility as well as skepticism, Keith and Danisch show with rigor, nuance, and care that the practice of civil communication is both paradoxical and sorely needed. Beyond Civility is necessary reading for our times. And so I'll give a little bio of each of the authors. You see my dogs have just escaped from where I had them. Apologies on that. As long as they're quiet, I guess they'll be fine. William Keith is professor of rhetoric. Bill, if you just wave your hand so people know. Okay. William Keith is professor of rhetoric at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Dr. Keith's teaching and research focus is on the intersection of argument, public deliberation, and science. He has written widely about the history of public participation in the US, as well as communication pedagogy. His books include Democracy as Discussion, The Ongoing Conversation, 100 Years of Communication Studies, and with Robert Danisch, Beyond Civility, The Competing Obligations of Citizenship. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
Robert Danisch has a PhD in communication from the University of Pittsburgh and a BA from the University of Virginia in history and philosophy. He is currently chair of the Department of Communication Arts at the University of Waterloo in Canada. His research interests concern rhetorical theory and public communication within democratic societies, and he has written extensively about the relationship between American pragmatism and rhetoric. In addition to Beyond Civility, he's also the author of a popular book on improving communication skills. What Effect Have I Had? 100 Communication Practices to Be a Better Partner, Teammate, Writer, Speaker, and Leader. Professor Danisch hosts a podcast called Now We're Talking that focuses on communication skills. At Waterloo, he teaches courses on persuasion, small group communication, leadership, communication ethics, and public communication. Welcome, Rob. I want to wave. Maybe you perhaps already did. And tonight we're welcoming David Frank, who is an American scholar of rhetoric and political communication with research specialties in rhetorical History, Theory, and Nonviolence. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Oregon, where he served as Dean of the Clark Honors College. Among his publications are 6 books and over 50 scholarly articles. He is the recipient of 6 major teaching awards. At the U of O, he helps oversee the Global Justice Program, which seeks to inspire students to develop the ability to use reason to help prevent violence and hate in personal, national, and international affairs. He has taught classes such as The Rhetoric of Racial Reconciliation, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and the Promise of Intersectionality, and Preventing Genocide and Mass Atrocities in the 21st Century. So we have a lot of collective wisdom on civility here with us tonight, and we're thrilled to have you. And I'm just going to turn it over to you, gentlemen, because I know you know what you're doing. Thanks for being here.
Kate, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting us again. We are working on some new stuff, and I'm not sure if anybody here has heard us last year. Welcome to anybody who's going to listen to us again. And we're going to have a slightly different take on things. And it's been actually, to be fair, a long year since we were first here. Yeah. A lot has happened in the last year. And our message isn't completely different, but it is somewhat nuanced by that. And our current thinking is about a project which the book was kind of theoretical, and this would bring it down much more to the basis of almost like a how-to book. Like, if you wanted to put this into practice, what would you do? And so much has happened. First, we had the election of 2020 with all the rancor that followed. And then January 6th seemed like one of the worst things ever. You had people killed, a lot of people perceiving that the foundations of democracy had been attacked, or that maybe that somehow justified what happened. And then it came home, right? I mean, a lot of people experienced a lot of distress in personal relationships. I lost friends over this. There were lots of disagreements, but some of them went very far. At a certain point, you feel compelled, like you have to draw a line. And so the problems that we have talking to people about public affairs and what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, are they completely different things, or can you actually draw a line from one to the other? How do we come to this? What do we do? So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about what the general situation is. And then David and Rob are going to follow up with some analysis and some things that point at solutions. So the first thing I want to say is, so what is actually the problem? The problem is something like this. The US has a public conversation that happens on many levels, right? And just because it's between 2 people doesn't mean it's not a public conversation, because if it's about public issues, then it's a public conversation. So in print, in all kinds of electronic media, entertainment, the news, water cooler conversations, hanging out and having coffee with friends and family, this is this whole huge ecology in which people process what is going on, what does it mean, what should we do, how do I feel? But this ecology, this huge system, which is, you could say it by analogy, it's like a pond, has now become a swamp, right? So a lot of people are very unhappy with it. What are the signs that things have gone wrong? You have all this toxic public discourse, people name calling, accusing. The temperature is very high all the time. You have extreme polarization. People think participating in these conversations is about my team owning your team and somehow getting the drop on them and criticizing them. It's about winning rather than about sort of really exchanging and thinking about problem solving. And to a certain extent, increasingly, our problems are very large, but all of our talk is very totalizing and apocalyptic. Everything is completely terrible. These other people are completely bad. We're going to hell in a handbasket, right? Everything is pitched so high. And the consequence of this is it's just hard to pay attention. It's hard to engage. We get too little deliberation. We get too little occasion to actually talk about, okay, so what really is the problem we're trying to solve, and what's the best way to solve it? Even disagreeing about that is difficult, right? Because there's so much more heat than light. And we've also had an incursion of conspiracy thinking, right? And that is a whole topic in itself, et cetera. But conspiracy thinking, again, is something that makes it hard to have these conversations. And so why is this a larger problem? Well, fundamentally, you may not like a lot of things about our politics, but politicians are still oriented to what constituents are saying and thinking, right? So if across the country people come to a certain mind about things, politicians tend to pay attention to that. So it does matter. The more toxic the talk, then the more toxic the politicians, and then we're locked into a kind of downward spiral. So having said what is the problem, I want to say what is not the problem. So what's not the problem is that people argue and argue hard, right? So sometimes people think because things are toxic now, there must have at one time been this sort of blissful Eden where all was harmonious and nary was heard a discouraging word, and that is just nonsense. Historically, clashing over ideas and values and policies is the core of US democracy. It always has been. These things are features, not bugs. We have disagreement, we have lively and rowdy disagreement. We deal with extremely complex problems. We have strong value disagreements. We actually think about the systemic character of problems. So the fact that we're doing hard things and we're disagreeing strongly does not mean that it's broken. That is not the broken part of it. So in terms of what I just called toxicity, why is civility the answer, or strong civility? So we talk in this book about strong civility. And when people think about civility, they often think about a related term, politeness, or a related set of concepts. Politeness is good in a way, but it's only a start. And in fact, what we call politeness is weak civility. So the basic, idea of politeness is to make people feel comfortable. And making people feel comfortable often means we don't talk about things that are difficult, right? So famously at the Thanksgiving table, we don't discuss religion or politics, right? A lot of families have this rule. Those are difficult things. People end up getting angry and it spoils the meal. So let's don't do that. So the rules of etiquette have a bias toward keeping the peace by avoiding things that are difficult. There are special times and occasions for dealing with difficult stuff, but the rules of etiquette are not a good guide for how we do things in those special occasions where we do our difficult work, right? So they're not good for the discourse of democracy. So as an alternative, we recommend what we call strong civility, or we're starting to call it radical civility. And so these are behaviors and communication practices that are used to respectfully engage others in ways that deepen our connections with them, right? So rather than pushing people away, rather than attacking people, we're trying to bring them in to make the engagement happen that helps the disagreement happen. It is about listening to understand and to talk about important issues to learn more, right? You don't always have to win. Sometimes you engage people and you have a back and forth because you want to learn to truly understand what they're thinking. Radical civility acknowledges and affirms others' beliefs and values. That doesn't mean you agree with them, but it also means you don't demonize them for being different from yours. It also means that you carefully, sensitively, but forthrightly share your own beliefs. You don't hide the things that you think because they're going to be upsetting to other people. So in the end, it's about having these productive and respectful conversations about hard topics. So radical civility is basically not demonizing someone for having wrong points of view, resisting totalizing thinking that a particular belief or commitment tells you everything about a person, right? They are just reducible to this, continually acknowledging and probing the complexity of other people. Everyone is so much more than any one or two or three different views, even if you find those obnoxious. And not stooping, not responding in kind to negative communication, and engaging people in good faith, even when they aren't always engaging you. So I said, what is the problem? What isn't the problem? What might be a solution, which is strong civility, why that might not be a solution. So let me just say really quickly, everybody's been on social media, I think, and watched things escalate like crazy, right? So a post of something and somebody reacts to the post and then the responses and then the anger and the spiral just goes up and up. And in many cases, these are strangers. In other cases, these aren't strangers. These are people you know and respect who you suddenly feel like are strangers because the way in which they are talking and treating you over an issue which actually isn't that important. So what's really hard about our approach is it sounds like it's about people's individual decisions to be radically civil. It is that, but the success of those individual decisions to be radically civil depends on appropriate systemic conditions, right? Like there has to be an environment in which they can make that kind of difference, right? In a two-party system, it's winner takes all. It's very hard to step back from that, right? From the idea that, well, if I'm not winning, then I'm losing and I don't want to be losing, right? It's not hard. It's hard not to continue the cycle of demonizing and retribution. And then do we really know anymore about big public important issues, how to deal with each other in good faith? That's a set of skills as well as a stance that you take, and do we really have them? And so one of the things that we're going to argue is that maybe at bottom, this is about habits of thinking and reacting as well as communication. And I'm going to let my friend David Frank talk about that.
Well, thank you. And again, thank you for inviting us, and to Rob and Bill for inviting me to collaborate with them, because I do believe that the book, Strong Civility, and the work that we are doing needs to be part of a larger curriculum, really beginning with families, moving into social movements and into public discourse. The book that we are discussing, I believe, should be a good book for bar mitzvahs. I think it'd be a good book for Christmas presents. I think it'd be a good book for any celebration that you want to really honor people being able to form good relationships and stay in good relationship. When I read the book, it struck me that it is a theory of disagreement. And it's a theory of disagreement that assumes that human beings are going to, either at the beginning or the end or the middle of a relationship, come into a disagreement. 50% of marriages in this country fail, and they often fail because people do not know how to engage their differences. And so as I read Bill and Rob's theory of civility, it is a strong theory because it is optimistic. It assumes that people can build strong relationships that can counter or can engage disagreement in a constructive manner. The majority, the 50% of the marriages that fail according to Gottman at the University of Washington, because people fall into states of contempt of one another. And Bill has said that the theory human beings have multiple, and that sometimes people are evil, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're rich, sometimes they're poor, and that we all host a number of different identities, and that when we come together, those identities are going to come into conflict. And so as a theory of disagreement, civility, strong and radical, holds that human beings can work out their differences without resorting to violence or to ignoring differences. So Rob and I might disagree, and he may have a different point of view than I do. And I can see him as someone who is essentially evil because he disagrees with me, or I could see him as another human being that has a point of view that I might learn from. And that's what strong civility tries to articulate. And it's also grounded in what Daniel Kahneman and other psychologists have identified as two modes of thinking, fast and slow. And so psychologists have identified two ways that human beings think. We think fast when we're trying to solve problems at the moment. And sometimes when we're angry, that fast thinking can get us into language, into a way of solving problems that are rooted in anger, animosity, and the failure to really think through things. There's also a style of thinking that's called slow thinking, where you are deliberate, where you use reason, where you slow things down so that you can use the rules of logic and reasonability to solve problems. Now, Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for doing research on this topic, argues that our slow thinking capacities are lazy. They have to be encouraged to be used. It's much easier to get angry. It's much easier to use fast thinking. It's much easier just to intuitive responses than to slow things down, let things gel, to back off a bit so that you can use, or one can use, slow thinking. And so the new evolution that we are taking in this theory of strong civility is grounded in part in fast and slow thinking, as well as a culinary metaphor that Rob will now share with you.
Thank you, David, and thanks to Kate and to Civility First for inviting us again. Yeah, so my part here is to talk through what Bill said at the very beginning, which was that we want to move in a direction of trying to explain how we enact strong civility. And what David was just saying, if we could do that, then we'd have a book that you could read at a bar mitzvah or any sort of celebration, and people could take away some practical advice about what they ought to be doing. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the hows of strong civility or radical civility. A couple of years ago, I don't go on Facebook very often, and now I don't post on Facebook ever, because a couple of years ago, a couple of friends of mine from high school were posting on there about healthcare in the US. And one of them said something about healthcare in Canada. And I live in Canada now, so I felt the urge to say something very moderate and restrained. I just said something like, well, in my experience, actually, like Canadian healthcare is really great. Like I don't pay anything. I can talk to my doctor the next day. And I post this thing at 9 o'clock. The next morning I wake up, there's like 57 comments, half of them calling me a communist, saying I've abandoned America, that I'm no longer allowed in the country. And these are people I've known for 25, 30 years. Some of them I was friends with 30 years ago. And I thought, oh, I'll just intervene one more time in a very measured way. And I was like, I think you're misconstruing my points. Really, I was just speaking about my own experience. And here in Toronto, this is like this. And, you know, maybe you know something that I don't know. But and then again, another 50 comments about how much of an idiot I am. So I just sort of shut it off. And this is true. I have not commented again on a Facebook post since that time. I can't even read them. And I think what's going on there is this fast, to pick up on what David was saying, this very fast thinking escalation of conflict and animosity and vitriol. And I think at this point, we've all had an experience that resonates somehow in our interpersonal interactions. They seem to quickly escalate in these ways that make productive conversation almost impossible. So in our view, strong civility or radical civility entails certain kinds of communication commitments, both as a kind of consumer or listener to others, and as a speaker or a writer or producer of communication. And if we're to follow a kind of praxis of strong civility, we're going to need to change some of our behaviors. And so the metaphor I'll trace in my few minutes here is it's sort of like changing your diet, only we should be thinking of it as our discursive diet. So the kinds of communication we allow ourselves to consume and to produce, metaphorically, the kinds of foods we eat and how we choose to cook and how we choose to prepare a meal, etc. If you take enough really dangerous or unhealthy food, then you might feel unhealthy. Your vision might be a little unclear. You might feel harsh or angry or upset, or your whole digestive system might be off, for example. So on the other hand, a healthy discursive diet is going to make you feel good. It's going to make you feel full of energy, hope, etc. So the question becomes, what causes that kind of, what kinds of communication cause that kind of toxic or unhealthy communication habits or practices? What do those look like? And then what do the healthy ones look like? If we're going to improve our diet, the first thing we need to do is remove the toxic elements from it, remove the foods that are causing us to feel unwell. In a sort of obvious way, that points to partisan social media, general news media, etc. Like, yes, we should spend less time on social media. And when we do spend time on social media, we should narrowly participate in it or more carefully participate in it. But why? What's going on in social media? How can I identify social media practices as toxic? Well, for me, there's a couple of sort of communication markers that we ought to be looking at. Three of them that I think are really important are hyperbole, what's called reification, and us-them language. So hyperbole is the intentional use of exaggeration. And just like my Facebook fight, like this kid I know from high school immediately called me a communist, which seemed like a kind of hyperbolic, exaggerated, overwrought description of my position. Why does someone use hyperbole? It's to engage in that fast thinking that David was just writing about. It's to engage someone's limbic system, which is the fast thinking response system. It's to get attention and to produce an emotional reaction. Hyperbole is really, really good at producing emotional reactions engaging the limbic system. It's really bad for democratic deliberation. It doesn't help democratic deliberation. So when you see hyperbole, you have a sure sign that you have a kind of toxic food or a kind of poisonous food that if it's in your diet and too much of it is in your diet, you're going to be in danger. Reification is treating other people as objects. And Bill was talking about, and so is David talking about, treating other people as multidimensional or complex beings. Well, a lot of discourse now reduces another person to some objective, singular feature that they have. This can be even as gross as like a physical feature. And I won't go into some of those insulting ways of describing people, but whenever you see a kind of direct personal insult that tries to reduce someone to one kind of characteristic, you have an example of reification. That also is kind of toxic food for your diet. It's going to make you unhealthy if you consume too much reification. The third thing, communication practice, I think we need to be on the lookout for is any kind of us-them language. So as soon as a communicator divides the world into a polarized, we're over here, those people over there are evil, as soon as you have an us-them construction, first of all, we need to recognize that the construction is made up. It doesn't really exist. It's brought into being through rhetorical practice or through language. When we bring us-them dichotomies into being through language in order to demonize the them and strengthen the kind of affective affinity in the us. But that, just like some bad foods, is also really toxic for us. It's really dangerous for our discursive diet. So we need to look out for the kinds of communication practices that have those three characteristics and minimize the extent to which we consume them. There are others too. I don't have the time to talk through all of them, but another kind of example that I think is important is, so if you listen to someone who's really angry, that emotion is contagious. And people in communication know this. It's contagious because of what David described as that quick thinking limbic system response. So if you're only exposed to angry people, guess what? You're going to be angry. So the tone of communication that we're consuming also matters a lot. And if that tone is only angry, then it's also a sign that our diet's not going to be very good. So if we want a healthy discursive diet, we need to minimize the extent to which we're exposed to hyperbole, to us-them language, to kind of anger as a tone, and to reification or objectification. Okay, well, we also need to eat broccoli or vegetables or something that's good for us. The question becomes, what are the communication practices that are like broccoli that can improve our health and make us feel better? Well, we also know what those are, just like we know what the toxic ones are. One simple thing that I think lots of people talk about is to read things you disagree with. So we have to be aware that in our quick thinking, we are biased. We have cognitive bias toward our position, toward the position we already believe in. It's another way of the phrase that I like to say is that beliefs have us. We don't have beliefs. And if beliefs have us, we seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs. Well, to have a healthy diet, you can't do that. You need to seek out things that you disagree with that complicate or challenge your existing beliefs. That will improve your communication practices in the long run. We need to practice what's called active listening. Active listening is a process of creating a space for someone else to share their story and their perspective in a way in which we're not judging or predetermining the nature or the quality of that perspective or that viewpoint. There's in our new book, we'll outline how to do that. Like, what does active listening look like? We also need to learn sort of what buzzwords exist or what issues or arguments get circulated and recirculated in an attempt to kind of harden positions or coordinate action so as to eliminate conversation. So in communication, we have what are called conversation stoppers. And we can identify conversation stoppers. We know where they are and how they work. Another version of this is like whataboutism, when someone says, well, what about, you're having an argument about X and someone says, well, what about Y? In interpersonal communication, this is called switch tracking. When one partner says, you're not being very nice to me right now. And the other partner says, well, what about the garbage? You never take out the garbage. You've switched tracks onto something entirely different. And the same thing happens in public discourse. There's a kind of switch tracking that happens, and we need to avoid that. We also need care and neutrality and objectivity. So broccoli is kind of boring. It's not the most flavorful thing on your plate. So is careful reasoning. So is objectivity and neutrality. When we want to make qualified statements. So in some cases, we may think that so-and-so is case. That's a really kind of qualified, careful statement. It's boring. It doesn't target the limbic system. It leads to the kind of slow thinking that David was describing, but it's necessary for a healthy discursive diet. So those are some of the things we might want to look out for as kind of positives, that the kind of careful reasoning, active listening, reading things you disagree with or looking for things that complicate your view, avoiding conversation stoppers and switch tracking and being able to actually engage with other viewpoints. The last thing I'd say is that we need to remember that eating is a kind of communal act. It's something we do together. We do it with others. That means a kind of healthy communication diet puts building relationships first. We have hard conversations when we've built a relationship first. And those of you that heard us talk last year, we said a version of that. That's strong civility is committed to relationship building. Once relationships are in place, you can have hard conversations. Relationship building is slow, meticulous work. It's not the kind of fast thinking where us-them hyperbolic language targets. We become a better person when we are willing to engage others and explore and hear what others have to say. And when we make it clear that our goal in a conversation isn't to win an argument, but to build a relationship. Once we start doing that, we kind of get in the habit of understanding that our communication practices are communal, our spaces for building community and building relationships, just like good eating is. So there's all this evidence out there that if you eat alone in your car outside of the Burger King parking lot, you're going to be unhealthy. If you eat at home at dinner time with your family and people you love and your acquaintances around you, you're probably going to be healthier. And the same is true for communication. If you're alone in your bedroom at night, ranting on Facebook into the night, you're probably don't have the best communication diet. If you're carefully invested in building relationships with others, engaging in active listening, careful thinking, avoiding hyperbole, etc., you're probably going to have a healthy communication diet. So the objective in strong civility is to flesh out what our communication commitments look like, what kind of communication commitments are entailed by this belief in strong civility. And the goal is that to improve both our own health, but also the health of the democratic system to which we belong. So I want to come back to what Bill said there when he was talking at the beginning. It's not just our practices, but it's the pond. It's the whole ecosystem that we live in. That ecosystem is endangered by toxic communication that circulates freely. And it's improved, it's aided, it's helped by the circulation of of communication habits that exemplify strong civility. So it's both a kind of communal and an individual project for rehabilitating our democracy. So I think that that's a good place to stop. The last thing I'll say is that I think I share with Bill and with David a kind of hope that democracy can be rebuilt. The pond can be, well, it doesn't need to be a swamp. It can be an exciting and beautiful ecosystem But it can only be that when the kind of communication practices entailed by strong civility are present. Without those practices, we won't have that thriving democratic ecosystem any longer. So thanks everyone again for giving us the opportunity to come to talk today.
Well, you have shifted a little bit from where you were last year, given everything that's happened in the country. I have a couple of questions given what you've just said, but I'm wondering if Paul or Vicki have any questions for our guests here tonight. Do you want to unmute or put them in the chat?
Hi.
Hi, Vicki.
Hi. I'm eating dinner, so I'm not going to show you my eating dinner thing. Yeah. So I would like a few sentences on what is the evolution since last year. What was it last year, and what is the new thing you've seen?
Bill, do you want to talk about last year? They talked really just about the book and strong civility, kind of the history of civility in a democratic society. And what the difference I'm seeing is you've kind of taken that, but worked with it enough. I really like that diet metaphor that works for this, and have switched to, given the power of communication in getting us to where we are now, what can we do to start shifting that back? That's what I'm hearing in what you're saying. What would you guys say?
I think that's right, Kate. Like, I mean, for me, I think I'm reminded this year that I'm not a political theorist. I'm a communication scholar. And that means I don't need to theoretically explain what we need for democracy. I need to show people how to live a democratic life. And I feel like our emphasis is moving from the what and the why to the how. Like, what is strong civility? Why do we need it? To how do we live? How do we live a strongly civil life?
Right.
And what the consequences of that how would be. But Bill and David can also, they might have their own view on that.
You're muted, Bill.
Sorry, trying to keep my noise down. I think the last year, the thing, the rise of conspiracy theory, which goes with this sort of two worlds business. So a lot of commentators are talking about how Americans as different groups seem to live in two different worlds. And the two worlds make it hard to say, because, the way people used to think about it is, well, there are things that everybody believes. So you start with common beliefs and you work through that toward differences. And there's fewer and fewer of those, which puts a lot more pressure on figuring out how do we develop relationships by going around or pushing that out of the way, right? It is increasingly difficult because media and all the things, that we consume, and I was having a whole bunch of metaphorical insights while we were talking about this. Obviously some things that you read make you bloated and gassy discursively. And, there are things that are the white sugar that make you kind of crazy, and then also make your digestion poor, and the stuff that comes out is not good. But so, taking all that stuff and getting it, just being able to make contact with people at all. So the problem that compared to a year ago, it seems like these disagreements go all the way down, like finding a place where you can say, did you like that new movie? Do you like this kind of food? Like, so what about the sports team? Like, having those conversations even is difficult. And so that's where the struggle, I think, is going to come, because the sort of common spaces of American life, cultural spaces, are more difficult to access.
Mm. Does that answer, Vicki? Oh, go ahead, David.
Yeah, the extension I see that Bill and Rob are making is in the direction of the radicality of what they are doing. Civility first, if you don't really understand it, your organization is quite radical, because you're assuming that you can bring people together who disagree and that they won't kill one another. And so what I find so wonderful about their project is that it is optimistic. It is saying that we can draw from the wisdom of 2,000 years of studying how people communicate with and to one another. It also assumes that people will that we can listen to. You know, listening is not just an action of being polite, it's an action designed to see if the opinions that we hold need to be revised. Active listening, it's not just a turn taking. I'm just waiting for you to fall silent and I'm nodding my head up and down. I'm really seeking in what you have to say something that can help me better understand the world. And that's what I find to be particularly radical about civility first and about the theory that Bill and Rob have set forth. It is radical. And I can tell you, and Rob and Bill will, I think, endorse my conclusion, but that in our field of communication, people are so pessimistic. There's a wide-scale belief that no one is open to persuasion. And political science, it just says, you know, mobilize your base. Don't worry about the other side. And this theory of strong civility, as they have developed it, is now not only strong, but it's radical because it really opposes the dominant streams of research in our field and in our culture at large.
Yes, we know that we're ambitious in our goal of shifting public discourse to be more civil because we are going against cultural norm.
Kate, this is Paul.
Hi, Paul.
The question I had, I typed in the note, but I can just state it now.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's Zomlin and others, his book, Against Civility, and others basically argue, as I see it, that people acting civil, it condones oppression. And I think what they're talking about is that soft civility that you guys identify. But I was wondering also if it, you know, they were quoting people that in the past have done things like civil disobedience. And then sometimes you could label some of that behavior as aggressive in a sense that it breaks a law, let's say, or comes into an establishment where someone says, I don't want you to be here. And so it's technically sort of aggressive, even though it's not violent. And so I'm wondering how you could describe how the same person can engage in activity like that, demonstrations and protests, and yet behave in civil discourse with someone who wants to respectfully discourse with them. Maybe talk about that same person be able to engage in both of those, because as I see it, it's that polarization attitude again. One person can only be one thing. And if you're engaging civilly, therefore you cannot also be that same person who might be at a demonstration or a protest or do something, some civil disobedience.
Right. That I was going to say that is something that I have been thinking about a lot more since last year. So in the book, we actually do talk about the idea of justifiable incivility, and particularly when you're looking at situations of structural oppression, stuff like this, where people, because really, if you think about it, this is about social change, right? So the conversations, the deliberative conversations we have are about how do we become the country that we want to be, right? And we all may, not all, but there's disagreements about what country we should be. And there are some things that seem so egregious, right? That it seems like, well, yeah, I'm not going to be polite about that thing. I'm going to be deliberately provocative. Not all demonstrations are uncivil, right? A lot of them are perfectly civil, right? I don't really understand. And so sometimes large demonstrations will attract riffraff at the side who break windows and stuff that was nothing to do with the purpose of the demonstration. The demonstrators weren't part of that. Other demonstrations can be very angry, very aggressive. And I think this is an ethical question about what do you think is justified. But I will say, I have a colleague who had been, he started last year thinking about, well, you know, maybe we need to mount a defensive rioting when we were talking about large scale oppression. And he was thinking in particular the fact that if you're African American, you get shot a lot, right? Violence is directed at your body on a regular basis, and the state, and to a certain extent, the populace seems to be okay with it. well, doesn't that justify you in feeling like you would do this? And my comment at the time was like, wow, so if it's okay for you, it's okay for people who believe other things. And you might be letting the cat out of the bag in a way that, right, or the toothpaste out of the tube can't be put back in. And then the January 6th happened. And so then the question is, so now these people believe they were justified, that, you know, that America was being taken over and that a violence response was. So once that becomes a legitimate part of things, then it's legitimate for everybody. And then suddenly it seems like another escalating thing. So I think a lot of people since the 1960s have thought of it as asymmetrically, like, so people fighting for civil rights and stuff, they demonstrate, you know, they get aggressive and stuff, but they're on the side of the arc of history. And so it's okay. Now there are several arcs and there are several stories. And so I still think there's justifiable incivility, but I also think that, you know, okay, there's a point at which we had a civil war, something like 750,000 people were killed, and we did not figure out race relations. We got, we ended slavery over that, but we did not give citizenship rights to African Americans. Like, if we can have that big a war and not settle it, I'm not sure how rioting and getting violent with each other now is actually going to make that change.
I'd like to add to that a little bit too. So one thing that I've been thinking about for years now is social change. And for me, our Beyond Civility, the book, was in part a book about generating social change. Right. So it is the case that I think weak civility, just mere politeness, can preserve the status quo. And it's often used to preserve the status quo. I have no doubt about that. But I think Bill and I went searching for a kind of mode of communication and practice that could generate durable, substantial social change without recourse to the kind of violence or violent rhetoric that has been and can be used by people in authoritative positions for millennia. So us-them rhetoric, for example, can generate political change. It can manufacture emotion. It can drive people to the polls. It can do work, but it doesn't do the kind of work that durably changes another person's beliefs or commitments or sense of the world or viewpoint. Those kinds of changes are more subtle, more complex, harder to achieve. And I think the radicalness of strong civility also, like everything that David said before about the radicalness, was right, but it also comes from the incremental nature of perceiving change. So small changes to beliefs and to decisions, et cetera, that aren't achieved through violence or through hyperbole or through us-them rhetoric, can multiply over time and can be productive over time. That's part of the hope, at least my hope in this project, that kind of vision of social change is a possibility. And I think people on both the left and the right just opt out of that hard work and opt into the kind of us-them hyperbolic rhetoric and think only victory over our opponent will produce change. And that is a very dangerous place to be, and not a theory of change that I want to be endorsing, at least.
Thank you. That's great. Vicki, I know, Beck, you said you have some questions, so I want to get to you too, but Vicki, your hand is still up. Do you mean for that to be?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah. I have a couple of other questions. And this is sort of like asking for sort of a best guess analysis. Do you think that the enclosure that's been enforced on us by the pandemic has actually potentiated the mutual hostility, that it's actually made us more susceptible to people who will inflame us left and right? It's made us less tolerant. And I'll just do a little side story. Is my observation is that, I mean, we've had an issue here with a community building, the Grange, and two different camps that wanted to sort of be the new face of it. And what I've noticed is that the people on the right who are not wearing masks and are being rebellious are actually meeting in person. And the people on the left, or the people who want to have it be a different signature for the Grange are, paying attention to the pandemic and doing what they should. I just wonder whether it's sort of like we look at, children losing a year of school, and social development. I wonder if society has lost a year, very crucial year, to the pandemic, and put us in a very weak space for being able to endure the next, 1 to 3 years when politics is going to be so heated. And is there a way, do you have any thoughts about that? That's one thing. That's one of my questions. And then the other question is, do you have not just, small inspiring stories, but do you have really stellar examples of civility first, some place where there was a conflict where people are at least allowing one another to have their opinions and not having to change each other? 2 questions. I will set up now.
Maybe I can answer the first one, and then Bill or David can answer the second one, because I love the first question. So I'm a committed American pragmatist, and American pragmatism always preaches that democracy is a way of life. And the central moment in that way of life is a kind of face-to-face contact with difference, with people that are different than you. It is a social enterprise, democracy. And so, yes, I think a year of a pandemic and magnified social isolation is terrible for democracy as a way of life. Anytime you have circumstances that mitigate against contact with difference and the opportunity to work out or work through or negotiate that difference, then you're not living democratically. And I think what we've seen is an accelerated and amplified sense that people remain in their silos, in their forms of social isolation inside their own groups, so that they have limited contact with people that are different from them, other than them. Even though we have the internet, which is supposed to be this great kind of point of contact with other people, it's not the case. So I think if you, like me, believe that democracy is this way of life, and that contact with others and working through differences is central to that way of life, then the pandemic could not have been good for like living a democratic life. It just couldn't have been. The second question is harder, and I think Bill or David might have a better answer than I have for the second question.
I'll disagree slightly with you about that, though, because the conditions for that getting together were already pretty terrible, right? So things, chances for people to come together, right? The segregation of American life, right? So the great sorting, that people live in different places and they manage to arrange their lives so they don't have to, that was already in place. And maybe it became more apparent to us during the pandemic, but it was not good already. So I tend not to romanticize the face-to-face moment. It's true that, on message boards, people go nuts, and on Facebook, but more so than they do in person, right? So that is an established fact, that people are more emotional and more verbally abusive than they would be in person. So you can do some of this stuff better in person, but Americans have gotten less good about being in person with each other. I think the answer to the second question is on the Braver Angels website. They have a whole section where they have success stories of people in communities coming together and talking to each other. The Braver Angels, I just did a Braver Angels event here in Milwaukee a few weeks ago, and it's and that's how you found out about it. Us, we had presented for them. It's an amazing system. And the other thing too that I was thinking as Vicki was talking is that it was only ever 20% of people who were working at home during the quarantine, right? 80% of people had to go out and go to their jobs. And so there were still a lot of people out, right? And it wasn't as complete a break. I think we just we're seeing the fact that we just are not around each other. And so there's a bunch of surveys that ask, how many friends do you have from the other party? You know, how many people in your family are from the other party that you have contact with and stuff like this. And it just seems to get to be less and less. And so is it that we lack the will to do this? We lack the skills to do this? Like all those things seem to come together.
Yeah, Bill is right. As early as 1910, one of my intellectual heroes, Jane Addams, was complaining about the organization of American society preventing contact between, in her case, she was talking about class and ethnicity, different ethnicities in Chicago and different classes in Chicago. And then, of course, Robert Putnam wrote this book called Upswing that pretty much everybody should read, which kind of tracks the kind of social connectedness through American society from the early 20th century to the end of the 20th century. And he finds this kind of peak moment, and it coincides with, you know, American doing really well as a society and then cratering afterward. And I think we're living in a period, regardless of the pandemic, where the worry about that contact is prevalent. So I didn't mean to romanticize the moment before the pandemic when everything was great. Bill is right; it wasn't all great.
Yeah, it's possible to build really good relationships online. It just takes more work in some ways. And Rob and I's intellectual hero is John Dewey, who was born in 1859. And the great limitation of Dewey is he came from a small town in Vermont where basically everybody was white and Christian and went to the same church. And it was a Congregationalist church, which is organized on a very level democratic format. And he took this to be really the ideal. Why can't everybody have this? Because everybody isn't from a small town in Vermont, right? And so there are places where you have to make accommodations to the fact that, in fact, America is this incredibly diverse, now huge, now technologized, now spread out place, and that we haven't always done a great job adapting to that. And people started worrying in the 1920s, as from between 1980 and 1920, we went from being majority rural and farm country to majority urban. And as everybody poured into the urban spaces, oh my God, all these weird people and immigrants, and they speak different languages, and what are we going to do? And America's falling apart. And they passed immigration laws in the middle of the 1920s, partly in response to the anxieties of being around all these people who were different. We've always struggled with difference. We've managed it in some ways well, in other ways poorly. But right now, it's ideological differences that seem to be driving people a little bit nuts.
Yeah. Thank you. Beck, what was your question?
Hi, I'm so glad you all are here. I've been enjoying this conversation so much. So I came to Civility First. Before Civility First, I was like, definitely would put myself in the activist camp. I was downtown Seattle for a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests, and but I also believe in conversations, and I always reference Paulo Freire and how he talked about our collective liberation being tied up in our conversations together. And so that's why I come to Civility. I think, so I have a few questions. I'll try to narrow it down to just a couple. As I was talking, I was just thinking about, okay, how was my experience through hearing you all talk about the book, and I think and then now it's thinking about the pandemic from Vicky's question, and I think about I during the pandemic I have 2 kids, and so there was no guidance for if you have children and you're going through a pandemic. It was just like, everybody isolate, and like a month or 2 in, parents are like, this is not really realistic. And so you have to bubble up, and you have to have conversations with people about what their comfort level is and what's important to them. Do you want to meet outside? Do you want us to wear masks? You're doing all these questions with people that you never did before. And so for me in particular, it really fostered a friendship with one woman at first, but then that expanded into a couple other women who I don't think, if it wasn't for the pandemic, I don't think these relationships would have happened. And the depth of those relationships wouldn't have happened because we wouldn't have had to have those kind of difficult conversations. And the active listening. I think, because we just had each other. For a while, it was just me and this other woman with our kids. And so we would go and play every day, and I would just listen to her life and respond to the things she's saying. And, you know, she would listen to my things. And so it just made me think about the space of parenting. You know, no matter who you are, if you're the primary caregiver, that is a space where it's so important. Active listening is so important, and it's so necessary in order to foster those relationships, to build your village. And so it made me think about that. And then I was thinking, how do we do this with kids? How do we help kids practice active listening? And it made me think about reading books. And, you know, they always tell you, like, read books to your kids, because then they'll be great readers and they'll be really smart. And I'm thinking about it, I'm like, well, when you're reading and you're looking for the comprehension, right, that's active listening. And I didn't think about it in that way before. And so now I feel like I'm going to approach just reading to my children differently. So thank you for that. And let's see, I have, I think one of my questions right now that has been circling a lot is the question of emotionality and civility. And so I am I am a feminist at heart, and I get what's the word? I'm also a yoga teacher. So I'm mindful that there are conversations about, you know, that talk about the Cartesian split, and they talk, you know, it's very much about just, you know, don't have any feelings and be completely neutral. And the feminist side of me is like, no, emotions are real and valid. And how can we hold the space for those things being valid and have a conversation about civility? So that has been a question that's been coming up a lot for me. And I'm wondering if you all had anything to say about it.
I think what Bill and Rob have identified is a way of dealing with feelings. And here, you and I might disagree, but I don't think that all feelings are valid. Some feelings are not grounded in empathy. Some feelings are not grounded in an accurate view of the world. And so what civility, strong civility and radical civility does, in my judgment, is to offer people the equipment to engage in the active listening and discussions necessary to distinguish the feelings that ought to be valid from those that ought to be questioned, interrogated, and perhaps revised. And so I see myself as well as a co-feminist. I see feminists arguing with one another and saying that their respective feelings are not valid. And so when there's disagreement even among feminists, what are we to do? And the one response would be for the feminist movement to split and divide into camps. And then you have the same patterns of disagreement and civil war that you see broadly in society. And so the answer truly is strong civility, which then gives people the equipment, the tools, the insights that they need to be able to live together in contexts of difference. And again, I go back to even to marriage, because, you know, I'm sure you and I have been to weddings of young people in their early 20s that look at one another and say to each other, you are perfect. You know, there's nothing wrong with you. And they discover they are different, that we are imperfect. All of us have flaws. And if they're going to remain married, they have to figure out how to make use of strong civility to keep the relationship glued together.
Yeah, I want to add to that too. Like for me, this is not a way of moving emotions or feelings out of the picture or diminishing them. Strong civility is a mode of communication that allows for constructive conversation with emotions as part of that conversation. So it's interesting what you said about kids. Like, I don't know what life is like in Washington State, but in Ontario now, there's a whole part of the curriculum in elementary school that's devoted to getting elementary school kids talking about their emotions. And my kids hate it. Like they don't want to do it, but they have to sit there and say, oh, I'm feeling angry about this thing that you've asked me to do to the teacher. And that's the first part of active listening. That when I teach it to my university students, it's like part one is knowing what you're feeling in any situation and being aware that that feeling may bias or influence your reaction to someone, and then being able to put it on the table as part of the conversation. Like, I'm upset about these things that are happening. Well, is there justification for that upsetness? Or so for me, strong civility is a way of putting emotional discourse into a kind of constructive conversation so that it can helpfully orient or generate engagement. I think when it's done in the kind of hyperbolic, vitriolic, angry kind of way, those emotions are destructive to engagements and dangerous. So it's the ways in which emotions are being centered in conversation, not that they are or aren't or being pushed to the side, that really, really matters.
Yeah, 100% on all this. This tracks with the fast, slow, right? Are you having the emotion, or is the emotion having you, right? So, and just, it is completely part of something to say, wow, when you put it that way, I find that really hurtful, right? There's nothing wrong with throwing that into it. It's something that somebody else needs to know, right? And then part of the engagement is that they need to decide how they're going to react to that, right? And that kind of determines what sort of relationship that you're going to have. So clearly there are going to be emotion, right? This is what drives us to do what we do in many cases. But, so I distinguish between like getting angry and then attacking the other person, as opposed to saying, what you're saying is making me really angry and I need to understand what you're saying, whether I should be angry about it or not. There's considered anger and there's this reactive anger. And the considered part, like, okay, we can establish this. And then at a certain point, it's like, yeah, okay, it just makes me mad when you say that.
And that, Bill, that's the exact kind of part of the emotional intelligence curriculum that's finding its way into elementary school. I know in California, they have a similar kind of thing, when what you just described is like exactly what the first and second graders are having to do. And I think that's
interestingly for them, it's a developmental issue, right? Like, so kids who are 3, 4, 5, 6 years old don't have full control of their emotions. They get literally taken over by them. They have tantrums, et cetera, like this. And now we're talking about adults who supposedly are developmentally different.
Who also have tantrums.
Communist.
Well, if I can, let me ask a question then, given the fast, slow thinking thing. If I hope that your book that you're working on now will, go even one step further, because if you're talking to a bunch of people who want to engage and who want to be civil, that's one thing. They're willing to learn the skills, they're willing to think about strong civility and practice it so that it gets easier and easier. And I'm not sure that slow thinking is lazy as much as fast thinking is louder. If someone is fast, this toxic diet of discourse is addictive, just like McDonald's is. And people love it, it makes them feel, energized. But how do we invite people who are fast thinkers and want to stay fast thinkers on that diet? How do we invite them into slow thinking? When they're not ready to make nice, as the Dixie Chicks would say. How do we engage people who aren't, ready to be civil or who think it doesn't work? Or I hope that some of your hows in it will be how to slow the conversation down enough to invite that slow thinking from the other side as well. I know that's probably a pretty skillful thing, but
yeah, that's an excellent question. And it's something that I'm always thinking about, and it's very, very hard to answer.
yeah.
I can tell you that I think one of the things that communication scholars need to, or one of the things that I put in the front of my mind as a communication scholar is that certain things we know that work in communication are modeling, mirroring, and repetition. So if you want someone else to enact strong civility, you have to model it for them. You have to model it for them over and over and over again, and know that in the way we learn how to communicate is through mirroring. And once that person starts mirroring one little bit of your enactment of strong civility, you know you're onto something. The problem, the fast and slow problem, is that it's easier to mirror the kind of fast thinking, quick twitch responses.
Yeah.
And it's really hard if no one in a position of leadership is modeling strong civility. So if you only have senators and presidents and governors and people and CEOs in positions of power modeling incivility or vitriol or anger, it becomes really difficult to imagine a path forward where someone from a more marginalized position could model strong civility and have that catch on. That's what troubles me the most. So if I'm in a class, I can model kind of communication for my students, and I'm the authority figure in the class. I do it enough times, they'll get it, and they'll mirror me, and I'll repeat it enough, and it'll go from there. But if no one in a position of power or authority is willing to do the modeling, and you're trying to model that behavior from a marginalized position, I think it's very, very difficult. And that worries me a lot. And I don't have a great answer for what to do in those circumstances.
Yeah.
I think too, right? So you can think about this, you know, when you put out a proposal like this, there's always somebody who asks the question, okay, smart guy, what about the impossible case? What are you going to do about the impossible person who has no interest in participating in this at all? And I'm not, right? So I think, you know, you begin with the coalition of the willing to a certain extent, because I think about a lot about this too. And there's this tendency to be drawn to, you know, what a mathematician would call the degenerate case, right? Like this is the hard one, this is the not, which is so difficult. And, you know, if there are people who have either personally or ideologically some kind of motivation to not want to engage in this way, I don't know that, right? So the thing is, of course, there are always going to be, you know, on sort of either side of the spectrum, 5 or 10% or something that are like that. But why is it that now people in the great middle find themselves drawn into this? So yeah. I'm more interested in that space than I am in the extreme space. You know, in a certain ideological sense, like Paul was talking about, somebody may be committed to the idea that civility itself is racist, and I am going to have no part of that. And we certainly, David and Rob and I know people that is their considered commitment, and they're very polite in person, but they're committed to the idea of incivility. And in some cases they do, they heckle speakers and they act it out and stuff. And okay, I see that, but I am talking about like a large group, a much larger group of people who feel lost now, who feel disconnected, who feel like, geez, you know, I just don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. And a lot, when you look at younger people and the way they're turned off from politics, they're turned off by the toxicity. It's just like the stench of this is more than I can take. And so I want to be apolitical, or or they get involved in justice movements where, again, it's us good guys against them bad guys. And now you're reproducing things which they don't realize are as toxic as the things that they don't like. So we're stuck in kind of a bad place.
But I think a lot of the middle is polarized, Bill.
Right,
I'm not
exactly.
talking about the edges that we'll never reach. I'm willing to let them go. But
okay.
How are we invitational to people who are just, who at the Thanksgiving table, who are, people we care about and really disagree with, and they don't see a need to engage?
I think Beck had the clue. It begins with listening.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was going to say that too, Bill. So I think it begins, there are tactics that you can use, including active listening, that you have to diffuse their fast thinking response. You have to slow the conversation down,
Right.
is my first impulse. And active listening is the best path to slowing the conversation down. It's a slog though. It's difficult. It's slow. It's hard. It's hard work.
And I find myself saying the equivalent of, I disagree with you, but I don't hate you, in different words over and over again, because they hear the disagreement as, oh, you think I'm crap. And no, I don't. I like you, but you're still wrong. David.
Yeah.
I'd go back to Vicky's good 2 questions. One about the fact that we've been hit by the COVID pandemic, and the second one, what are the contexts that do encourage the kind of civility that Rob and Bill have written about. And I would point to a book written by James Fallow and Deborah Fallows, and they went to about 40 small towns in this country, and they found that the national disputes that are dividing us are not salient or as present in the local communities. And that's because people are together, they are in contact. And if there's any psychological theory that has been verified in the literature, it is that contact hypothesis, that you're much more likely human being if you are in fairly constant contact with that human being. And so the book that James Fallow and Deborah Fallows has written identified that in the small communities, people have to live together. They have to go to the same schools. They have to form soccer teams. They are members of the same PTA. And so people are, to a degree, getting along in the small. Bill pointed out the real the evidence of pragmatism is breaking out.
So is Whidbey Island a small town in that sense?
You know, it is and it isn't. It's culturally different north to south, because Oak Harbor is a military town located up south, up north, and South Whidbey sort of sees itself as a community. The villages are communities like that. You know, there are villages all up along up to Oak Harbor, which is a little bit larger.
If I might, Kate, just to address that question these guys ran, I think is an important one. How do folks in the middle come to want to hear each other? And I think you can't just say, well, you're in the middle and you've got a disagreement, get together. There's got to be a problem to solve. And I think what we're finding more and more, and this is what happened the day they actually created Civility First, was that people used to be able to talk together about lots of different things. Maybe they didn't have a lot of problems to solve, but they missed, and this is what we hear a lot from the people that do join us, is they missed being comfortable with each other so that they could just chat with each other and be together. And then family members, we focus more and more on family, and we're hearing more from that. So is Braver Angels, seeing more about family members saying we're tired of being separated, not just by miles, many times, many miles, but also by temperament and point of view. And we can't be comfortable with each other, and we're tired of that. So we need some help in doing that. And that's really where the motivation seems to be in the middle.
Right. Well, we're moving in on the last 5 minutes of our time. And I want to invite anyone here tonight and who may be seeing this in the future to come and check out our website, civilityfirst.org, and maybe sign our pledge that keeps this on your radar, being civil. And before we close, and thank you very much, all 3 of you, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to this book you're working on, so keep at it. We'll use it. We'll use it for our workshops and so forth. Do you have any closing comments? Some optimistic closing comments that you would like to share before we pull it to a close?
Yeah, I kind of think, as Paul was saying, there is sort of maybe a silent majority of people who would like things to be better. It just, everything in the context kind of militates against that in a certain sense. And I also want to say, I think the discussion we've had about emotion is really great. And this is a theme that's been sort of below the surface in the book, and we're definitely going to bring it up to the top, and we're going to give Beck some credit for that. because that was exactly the right question to poke us into that. But yeah, it's I think the test to me is going to be, can we get through the 22 elections without serious violence?
Yeah.
Right. That's the place that we're at. That is frightening to me. It's not just harsh language, but that people are going to take that as a reason to move on. And so I have some, if we make it through that in reasonable shape, then I will be optimistic.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I think it's useful to remember, for me, this might not be optimistic, but I think it's useful to remember that for democracy to succeed, we need citizens equipped with communication practices that are constructive problem solving, which isn't so hard to achieve. It doesn't look like we have it right now, but we could if we really wanted to. But we also need systems that put those citizens in places where they can engage in constructive problem solving interactions. My worry is more on the system side these days. I look at the systems we all inhabit, and I think American democracy is dangerously close to an edge of failing, not because there aren't citizens with a willingness or ability to engage in constructive problem-solving conversations, but because they inhabit systems that are not positioning them in ways in which they can live those kinds of lives. So I'm hopeful that the practices part can be solved. I'm worried that the systems part might not be able to be solved in the immediate future.
All right. David, you're muted.
I would call you to look forward to this next book, because Rob and Bill have, in the first sections, identified active listening as really the first step that we need to take. And so cultivating that ability to listen with care, with empathy, and do so to seek out, to figure out how we can honor other people and their words. I think that's the first step that we need to be able to take.
Yeah, and if we can, Facebook makes money off of our anger, and that's one of the reinforcing systems that Rob is talking about.
That's
and
right.
If we could do something about that, that would be an improvement.
I agree. Well, one of the things we're doing about it is inviting people like you to share your wisdom, which you have done it with great skill tonight, and I appreciate it. So Paul and Vicki, thank you for showing up with us tonight. And we're going to say thank you to both of you and free you up to your evening. Thanks, Vicki, and for your question too, because it gave rise to so much conversation. And I'm going to ask the authors just to stay behind for a moment.